Hello everyone. We're starting off tonight with something a little more complex, if not offensive. The inn from the Middle Ages. It was here that weary travellers encountered dubious stew, ale and lice were free to roam, and you spent half your night wondering if the person upstairs was dozing or dying. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. The sound of someone sneezing straight onto the floors beneath his chamber, followed by a moan, a smash, and the distinct clatter of a chicken escaping through the front door, is what wakes the innkeeper up, not so much the other way around. He opens one eye again. It's either too early or too late because it's still dark outside. When it comes to medieval timekeeping, there is no middle ground. Slowly, as though removing a loaf of bread, he gets up and wipes the sleep from his face with a sleeve that used to be linen, but now feels like a shabby saddlebag. His bed is modest, but not horrible. A slightly sloped straw mattress with a blanket that has a subtle scent of ale from last Tuesday and garlic. Cozy in the sense that if you don't ask too many questions, a slightly moist cloak is cozy. He puts on his clothes in phases, starting with the tunic, followed by the pants, and then, if he can find it, the belt. He looks around and finds it hanging on a nail behind the door, along with a candle stub, a spoon, and a sock belonging to someone. He doesn't inquire as to who. It's a mistake to ask inquiries before sunrise. The common room downstairs is eerily quiet. Life is evident. A man dozing beneath a table with the assurance of someone who has done this before, a tipped mug, and a boot beside the fireplace. The innkeeper avoids him with caution. Getting guests up too early frequently results in uncomfortable, combative conversations. With a well-practiced flick of the poker, he warms the fire. Warmth, not a roaring fire, is the aim. The last time he had a genuine fire going, someone attempted to roast a goose indoors with its feathers still on it, and firewood is costly. He hears the clomp of early travellers arriving, and the distant bray of a mule as he places a pot over the fire, ready to reheat whatever last night's stew has turned into. He lets out a breath. The inn isn't glitzy, but it's busy, comfortable, and most importantly, it belongs to him. In an instant, the day starts once more. The inn's breakfast is more of a compromise between what is edible and what is permissible under the law than it is a meal. A big scoop of stuff is ladled into a saucepan over the fireplace by the innkeeper. It smells like something between boiling oats and a damp boot that has been thinking about cabbage, but it has no name. This is pottage, a medieval mainstay that is more of an idea than a dish. Turnips and barley were used to make yesterday's pottage. Today's has some enigmatic parts from a goose that didn't make it out last night, as well as those same turnips, which are now softer. Heat, add water, and repeat. It's similar to soup that quits in the middle. The bread is there, chewable, and as hard as a roof tile. The innkeeper cuts it carefully, primarily to avoid breaking another knife on it. Visitors chew it, slowly, in part to aid in digestion and in part to give them time to consider their life decisions in between mouthful. What about the ale? Yes, beer with breakfast. It's a necessity, not a medieval cliché. Here, the water is dubious, tea is still a distant merchant's dream, and the milk is set aside for the Lord's barn cat. At least the brew has been cooked and filtered out of sheer desperation, even though it is poor. Even the kids, under strict supervision, drink it. After all, this is a respectable establishment. At this point, visitors are arriving one by one. A drowsy pilgrim still holding his walking stick and complaining about blisters, a trader clutching a coin purse like a sacred artifact, and of course, the bard who asks for honey for his porridge as if it hadn't been stored in a chest for weeks. The bartender, nimble and impervious to foolishness, moves between tables like a frustrated dancer. She greets customers with a grin, refills mugs, and sidesteps uninvited praise with the poise of someone who has committed to memory every terrible poetry a drunken tourist could utter. The inn smells of ambition, smoke, and barley at the conclusion of breakfast. Spirits are lukewarm, stomachs are stupid, and empty bowls clatter against tables. It's hot, full, and no one has died yet, but it's not fine dining. It is a victory by medieval standards. People are the one thing a medieval inn definitely needs more of. But by mid-morning they start to arrive in droves with the same attention to personal cleanliness as pigeons carrying bags. A knight, or someone posing as a knight, enters the room first. Yes, he has armor, but it's rusted, mismatched, and secured by what appears to be curtain rope. Even though he has little money, no manners, and the general odor of a horse that has lost a wager, he insists on having a separate room. A merchant's apprentice behind him uses buttons to pay, yet talks like he owns a fleet of ships. He attempts to bargain for a bowl of soup, as if this place had Groupon discounts. The bard follows. There is one in every inn. He never actually pays, but insists that his songs are worth more than gold. They aren't. He picks up a lute with 6 missing strings and starts singing a melancholy song about goat stealing and broken hearts. This was not requested. Next a monk enters, blesses the furnishings, and nods solemnly at everyone. Eyeing the bread, he vehemently insists on fasting. He eats the bread within 10 minutes while stating that in theory it is not sinful if the loaf was already broken. By midday, the inn is crowded with conflicting personalities and odors. Near the fireplace, someone is drying their socks. For no apparent reason, someone else is honing a knife. A resentful geese chases a toddler as they run between tables. The innkeeper, as composed as a monk on payday, is watching as 2 travelers quarrel over who gets the single stool that doesn't wobble in the corner. He's witnessed it all. He is aware that by nightfall someone will fall in love, someone will nod off in their soup, and someone, likely the bard again, will challenge a stool to a duel. He nods to the barmaid, pours another mug, and uses a rag that has seen better days to wipe the counter. A tacit understanding that this area is still operational in spite of everything. He wouldn't have it any other way except for a more subdued atmosphere and fewer goose chases, but the visitors are what make the inn what it is, despite their unpredictability, loudness, and occasional bleeding. The barmaid is the inn's soul, or at least its working brain. Marjorie is her name. She may be in her 20s or 30s, or perhaps she simply grew older quickly due to her exposure to traveling poets. Nobody is certain. People are aware that without her, the entire enterprise would fall apart into a mess of stew. With one hand supporting a tray of mugs and the other swatting a straying hand that miscalculated her patience, she navigates the turmoil with practiced accuracy. She has quicker reflexes than a ferret in a pantry. Once, a drunken mercenary attempted to compliment her ankles and had his boots nailed to the ceiling when he woke up 2 days later. Marjorie can insult a noble without actually committing treason, pour ale without dropping a drop, and take orders in 4 different dialects. She is efficient and not impolite, and she is the only one with real power in a structure held together by splinters and half-promises. She is aware of which tourists will attempt to bargain with seashells and which will pay with cash. She can spot a ring that has been stolen, a phony accent, and a flirtation that is passed off as a food complaint. Even the monk is aware of sin despite his mumbling. The patroness of keeping things going is Marjorie. She begins her day before the sun rises and ends it long after the fire has gone out. She will serve stew, chase kids, tend to a skinned knee, and somehow find time to refill all the mugs in the room, often while avoiding falling silverware or settling a dispute over who gets to keep the goat that wandered in during lunch. She never drops the tray, though. That's what makes it magical. On paper, Marjorie does not manage the inn, but in reality, it is her kingdom. The floor is within the innkeeper's control, even though she may possess the walls. A scathing remark here, a wink there, or a look that might make you sour. She does it every day with the grace that only comes from years of high tolerance and low expectations. It's a delicate dance. Lunch in a medieval inn is more of a test of teamwork, patience, and noise tolerance that falls somewhere between a festival and a siege than it is a meal. It starts off simply enough. The stew is simmering, the hearth is warm, and Marjorie rings the rusty iron triangle that indicates the supper is ready. A quiet moment, short. Then there was confusion at the level of a stampede. Visitors appear around corners you were unaware of. A trader jumps over a dog that is asleep. As if he were advancing into combat, a bard slings his lute over one shoulder. Even though there are 6 unoccupied benches and no one is keeping score, 2 farmers quarrel over who got seated first. Steaming bowls of pottage, a dish whose precise ingredients are only known to the pot and perhaps to divine entities, are served by the innkeeper. Unless you consider turnip to be a flavour, it's warm, filling, and flavourless. A visitor inquires as to whether it's vegetarian. "What does vegetarian mean?" asks another. The innkeeper acts as though he is not aware of either of them. With the customary clunk of a freshly used doorstop, bread is distributed. In an effort to soften it, diners try dipping it in their stew, which leads to multiple casualties at the bottom of bowls. A man attempts to exchange his crust for an additional serving of ale. It functions. Despite the bustle, Marjorie manages to keep her tray full of mugs and maintains the 1,000-yard gaze that only battlefield medics and women who have had to resolve 2 debates about proper seating before midday can adopt. In a one-woman act that is worthy of praise, she simultaneously serves meals, grins, and gives warnings. Yet she will only accept a full tip jar. Between mouthfuls, a curiously happy monk hums a hymn while 2 guards compete to outburp one another somewhere near the hearth. Once more, the goat is back. It appears to take pleasure in the companionship. According to the Sun, lunch lasts approximately an hour. The length of time spent inside the inn is determined by how long it takes someone to accuse someone else of cheating at dice, spill ale on themselves, or try to sing while eating an onion. And after it's over, there's a brief, unsettling silence before someone drops a spoon and everything starts over. The stew has been eaten, the bread has been chewed, lunch is ended, and the goat has once more been led away with a broom and severe words. Cleaning up after visitors who swear they were very neat is the portion of the day that innkeepers hate the most. Although it could appear to the uninitiated eye to be a typical dining room in moderate disarray, Marjorie and the innkeeper see it as a full-fledged archaeological excavation site, complete with unexplained stains, misplaced personal belongings, and an extremely unnerving quantity of onion peels in places where onions shouldn't have been. Like the innkeeper, the cloth used to wash off the wooden tables has seen too much. It merely smears everything into a lovely medieval glaze rather than cleaning. The floors are swept, primarily by shoving objects beneath benches and relying on gravity to do the rest. One of the stools has a boot found below it. It is placed to the expanding pile behind the bar with the label possibly belongs to someone, but no one claims it. With the speed and accuracy of someone who has been doing this every day for 10 years and would really like to quit, Marjorie begins to collect dishes. Visitors who stay too long are given the stare, which is so powerful that it once caused a noble to apologize and tip a whole silver coin. The story is still a legend even though he was never seen again. They scrape the stew pot clean. Whatever is left over is either subtly added to the recipe for tomorrow or fed to the pigs. Don't waste it, don't want it, especially after the third bowl when no one can tell the difference. Everyone knows that the innkeeper will simply rinse the mugs in the rain barrel and refer to it as divine purification, even though he mutters something about washing them. Although there is a bucket for soaking, this is mostly a ceremonial activity. The room begins to look more like an inn than the scene of a particularly well-fed riot, as the last of the crumbs are wiped away and the benches are rearranged, somehow always swaying more than before. Breathing deeply, Marjorie straightens her apron and is ready for the following wave. Peace in a medieval inn is only the momentary lull between one mess and the next, and somewhere people are already inquiring about when dinner will be served. It occurs just as the last bowl is piled high, the last spoon is quite dry, and Marjorie is brave enough to take a sip of the remaining ale without being bothered. The door opens with a squeak. New visitors, new faces, new issues, and most importantly, new inquiries. Wearing an enormous cloak, a beard that could conceal a number of woodland creatures, and an attitude that says he's going to evaluate the area on parchment, the first traveller enters. He asks, "Do you serve almond milk?" as he approaches the bar. The hush is complete and instantaneous. A stool in the corner groans beneath the weight of everyone's opinions. Behind him, a young couple asks to see the room first. They are obviously unmarried based on how close they are standing and how determined they are not to touch. Marjorie just gestures up. It has walls, is made of wood, and doesn't leak in the heat, typically. Covered in dust and conceit, the third visitor demands to know whether the stew is produced ethically, where the inn gets its candles, and whether the goat has been instructed to stay outside. Naturally, the goat comes at that very moment and immediately sneezes on his boots. Then there is the bard, this time a different one, who demands payment in song. He begins a ballad about the woman in the leaky chamber pot after plucking his lute and hitting 3 consecutive incorrect notes. They want him to cease right away, with courtesy, using a broom. Every request, every grievance, every mispronounced query concerning wine types are all handled by the innkeeper with a nod. It's a reddish wine, the only one. He just listens, grins, and lets Marjorie handle it. He doesn't correct or debate, because travellers with opinions seldom arrive quietly, and if there's one thing that fills an inn faster than rain, it's them. By sunset, the common room is a patchwork of personalities, including the goat, which is currently sleeping beneath table 3, the squabbling merchants by the fire, the bard, who is making his second try to win people over with loudness, and the quiet scribe in the corner. The innkeeper exhales. Another group of visitors, another set of minor catastrophes awaiting them, and everyone somehow believes they are the typical ones. Dinner time comes with a lot of noise, overlapping cacophony rather than elegance. Mugs clink, chairs scrape. Even though they arrived 9 minutes ago and are still wearing their travelling cloak like a crown, someone coughs theatrically to give the impression that they have been waiting for a very long time. Marjorie comes out of the kitchen with a pot that is unquestionably still stew, but is technically still heated. The menu for the day is still the same. Reheated somewhat, whatever was left over from earlier is still the inn's specialty dish. The guest's commentary is provided alongside a piece of bread that may be used as a blunt weapon. A suspicious traveller remarks, "This stew tastes different than last night." Marjorie says, "It's the same stew," without raising her gaze. Well, anything. They add rapidly, saying it's lovely, and now they're afraid of losing their cutlery privileges. Somehow, still present, the bard offers to honour the meal with a song. After he finishes one verse, Marjorie, a bit too enthusiastically, puts a ladle in his bowl. He understands the message. The couple talking over how many fleas they counted on the bed upstairs is somehow quieter than the boisterous argument between two merchants over by the hearth about grain prices. The goat is back. Once more, it is being subtly fed beneath the table by a child who claims it is his emotional livestock. Everyone eats, even though there are sporadic complaints about the meat's existential ambiguity, texture, or temperature. The ale also flows freely, adding to the stew's satisfying qualities. Behind the counter, the innkeeper watches his customers with the look of a guy who has come to terms with his lot in life while polishing a mug that hasn't been really cleaned since last harvest. He is aware that within an hour or so someone will stutter, someone else will nod off in the middle of a phrase, and the bard will try again. He never fails to try again. For now, though, the space is lively, cluttered, and noisy, all of which are indicators of success, if nothing else. Because the only need for supper in a medieval inn is that it arrive without catching fire, not that it be excellent. The real performance starts as the last spoon clatters against the bottom of a bowl, and diners start to recline with the contented moans of those who have made it through another round of stew. Evening entertainment, loosely defined, no flyers, no presenter with a lute and a schedule, no planned program. The night just goes as all great performances do, with little talent, no structure, and a high risk of minor injuries. Naturally, the bard takes advantage of the situation. The Fair Lady of Festerwell Who Married a Troll is the title of the ballad he announces after dramatically clearing his throat and plucking 3 ambiguous strings. The innkeeper pours himself a mug of ale and takes a deep sip, the way a man does when he knows that there are still 6 verses left and that at least one of them will include sock theft. Half the audience cheers, the other half moans, the goat sneezes, his voice is exuberant, and the lines rhyme occasionally. 2 old pals are competing against one another in a slurred riddle game at the distant table. It's unclear what the rules are. It's possible that one of the riddles is a recipe. At a volume usually associated with church bells, a monk in the vicinity shields his ears courteously and begins humming prayers. Next are the dice. There are differing views on whether it is wood, chipped, and maybe blessed or cursed. Coins, buttons, an extremely old pair, and one man's left shoe are used to place wagers, while a small throng assembles. No one challenges it. The worth of the pair is up for debate. Marjorie has exceptional hearing and flies around the room like a falcon. She is keeping an eye out for Spilldale trouble and anyone who appears to be going to stand on a table. The bard tries to make a theatrical move on a bench leg, but she catches him in mid-step. It was obviously not intended for theatre. A timid traveller in the corner plays a flute. Before the goat hits him in the head, it makes 3 beautiful notes. Everyone applauded. In certain towns, evening entertainment at the inn isn't well rehearsed, polished, or even completely legal. It's real, though, it's noisy, and it nearly always ends with someone waking up with a fresh tattoo in soot or sleeping into their mug. The inn doesn't have a set closing time, no lights out signal, no bell, and most definitely no courteous usher beckoning customers to the door. No, closing time is more of a slow breakdown of society. When the bard eventually loses his audience, it starts. This typically occurs when he substitutes theatrical throat noises for the final verse's words after forgetting them. A bread crust is thrown by someone as a token of gratitude. Whether it's applause or a bribe to stop is unknown. A few customers then begin to sag, from sheer caloric weight, not necessarily from ale. The stew has calmed down, gravity has prevailed. One merchant becomes furniture as he reclines so much on his stool. He serves as a footstool for his companion. As if constructing a miniature castle, Marjorie begins piling empty mugs. She simply raises one eyebrow, which in innkeeping parlance implies to wrap it up. or begins sweeping without saying anything further. After the hearth has gone out, there's usually that one visitor who insists on placing an order. A salesman believes that a light snack equates to a full roast duck tonight. Bread, a look, and a firm advice to chew carefully and go to bed sooner are delivered to him. By the embers, the ever-present goat has curled up. Although it is officially prohibited indoors, exceptions are made because it currently receives more attention during story time than half of the human population. The innkeeper gets to work. After years of careful repositioning, he gently nudges a snoozing traveller off a table and onto a bench, checks that no one has fainted face down in the stew pot, and prods at the dwindling fire. A couple heads upstairs colliding with everything in their path. By dawn they will be complaining about the noise. We take note of the irony and store it for future passive-aggressive entertainment. The room eventually fills up, not all at once, but rather in gentle, swaying waves, resembling a wave of cloaks, yawns, and the odd hiccup. The laugh stops and the chatter stops. The inn becomes silent, in a way. Off a table, a mug rolls. A footwear is dropped by someone upstairs. The goat lets out a long sigh. However, for the time being, the worst of the day is over. The visitors are no longer talking and are either asleep or at least horizontal. It takes faith to ascend the steps of a historic inn. Not faith in a spiritual sense, structural. The steps moan, creak, and shift underfoot every now and then as if they were thinking about retiring early. However, upstairs implies one thing to the tired traveller: a spot to fall. The rooms are different. Some are secret, unless you're rich or make a big deal out of it. However, the majority are communal, dorm-style sleeping arrangements where people pretend not to hear each other and strangers sleep just inches away. The beds are made of wooden frames filled with dreams and straw. If you're lucky, blankets, pillows, unless you packed your own, or folded your cloak in a unique way. The straw does really rustle, always. There are moments when it's dry, and other times when something inside it is attempting to fall asleep. Snoring is unavoidable. Whenever someone lies down, they always begin. Not cutesy, light snoring. We are referring to the type of snoring that makes you wonder whether there is a wild boar in the rafters because it reverberates off wooden beams. One visitor throws up while he's sleeping. Someone else speaks. A hymn is hummed via the nostrils, which is extremely disturbing. The concept of privacy does not exist. You can cover your head with your cloak, but it won't stop someone in the adjacent bed from talking loudly about nightmares about taxes and fish. The chamber pot, hidden behind a curtain that no one can see, is the secret reason why someone else keeps getting up to check on the stew. In relation to that, the chamber pot, sure, it's present. It's completely filled. It's a problem for everyone. Additionally, it serves as a footrest until the person realizes their error too late. Every now and then, someone enters after dark, not sure which bed belongs to them, and ready to quarrel. Arguments are usually settled by whoever has the bigger boots or greater odor, and they are usually short and muffled by fatigue. Nevertheless, there's a strangely reassuring quality to it, despite the sounds, the odors, the dubious straw, and the shared air. 12 people from various locations are snoring in unison while resting beneath the same crooked beams. Although it's not quiet upstairs, it's safe, somewhat warm, and fortunately goat-free, which is a treat at this hour of the night. It's late. There are only glowing embers left from the fire. With the exception of the occasional groan that makes you question whether the structure is settling or whether something living is moving through the beams, the common area is finally quiet. In any case, the innkeeper's nightly patrol is about to begin. Every innkeeper is aware of this custom, even though it isn't documented anywhere. A candle's stub, a weary sigh, and a silent prayer that nobody has killed, sparked a fire, or wandered into the pantry again are all part of it. Downstairs is where the tour starts. The cups are half spilled, half drunk, and perhaps fermenting into something new, while the benches are largely deserted. Within the ale barrel, a spoon floats. The innkeeper is not interested in learning how or why. He examines the front and rear latch doors, most likely. Perhaps, when there are strong gusts or heated discussions, the front one has a tendency to swing open. Just in case, he places a bucket in front of it. He counts the coins from the day's exchange behind the counter. It's mostly actual money. Buttons, carved bones, and that same old pair make up a portion of it. He puts it in the dish of undetermined values. Upstairs is the next stop. He treads carefully, like a man scuttling through a pack of wolves who are only slightly inebriated. He is betrayed by each floorboard, which creaks louder than the last. Behind one door, someone snores with determination. Someone mumbles in their sleep about taxes behind another. He peers into the communal space, which is a sea of cloaks and limbs. One visitor is dozing off inverted. Another has taken up residence beneath the bed, resembling a human storage container. As usual, the chamber pot is full. Then comes the odd portion of the patrol. Items that ought not to be moving. There's a broom overturned, once more. There is no draught, but the flame flickers. Even though the bard was either tied to the wagon outside or went to bed 2 hours ago, he can still hear the distinct sound of a lute string being plucked. Depends who you ask. Of course, the goat isn't there either. Once more. The innkeeper exhales. By the standards of this inn, everything is all right. If anything catches fire, let it be the bad stew, he murmurs as he climbs the stairs and extinguishes the candle. Although everyone is theoretically asleep in the middle of the night, let's not pretend that they are. Human anguish hums through the shared upstairs room. The predominant sound is snoring, which is layered, multi-layered, and incredibly unmusical. Like a hiccuping squirrel, one of the guests snores in brief spurts. Another goes for volume, vibrating the rafters with every exhale. Sleep apnea is like a symphony. Someone talks in their sleep mostly about carrots. Another keeps whispering, "No, my lord," in a tone that suggests either a horrible dream or a love mistake. A boot hits the floor with a bang. No one moves, not even the goat, which is now curled up under a coat, as if it owns the place. Straw mattresses are not recognized for their ergonomic support, so every time someone rolls over, which happens frequently, the bed frames squeak in protest. In fact, the bed is most likely haunted if you aren't stabbed by a twig within the first 5 minutes. The heat comes next. The temperature rises to barn in the summer when there are so many bodies in one space. Someone chooses to open the shuttered window, bringing in a breeze and the local owl, who now won't leave after cloaks are shed and blankets are kicked. The odour? It's what we may kindly refer to as robust. Warm goat, unwashed socks, stew digestion, and the hazy spectre of ale combine to create an aromatic mixture. If everyone wasn't already too exhausted to give a damn, it would be intolerable. Every now and then someone awakens with the belief that it is dawn. It isn't. The only difference is that it's darker now and an owl is observing. With a grunt, they are pushed back into position after stumbling out of bed and stepping on a hand. Marjorie sleeps in the rear room, ear trained to pick up anything alarming. Loud shouts, abrupt noises, or music played by lutes after hours. Everything is going okay so far, for the most part. The innkeeper is sleeping on a chair that is precisely the curvature of his spine downstairs, behind the bar. He is holding an unfinished mug. He dreams of silence he won't understand, because there are shared areas, short shifts, and questionable warmth when it comes to sleep in a medieval inn. Everyone is still horizontal, though. That is regarded as a win. At the first glimmer of light, that dim, hazy grey that might be dawn or perhaps a hopeful moon, the inn starts to move, not in a graceful manner. It's more like a barn full of animals who realize the door hasn't been locked. Different levels of dedication were shown by the way feet touched the floor. Someone lets out a loud moan, as though waking up was a complete and utter injustice. Right away, another visitor starts looking for their lost boot. It's on the fireplace. Nobody's sure how. The goat does, but he's not telling. Waves of people leave the common area. Those with a guilty conscience, merchants, monks, and early risers, leave first. Muddy footprints, rumpled sheets, and one still sleeping traveller who maintains, even in his dreams, that he did not touch the cheese, are all left behind. The innkeeper is already up downstairs. Technically, his eyes are open, his body is upright. But somewhere with spotless mugs and silent patrons is still halfway between our world and wherever old bartenders go in their dreams. Shortly after, Marjorie shows up, clad in a shawl and full of resolve. She starts her silent damage inventory for the night. 2 upturned stools, 1 missing candle, and someone bizarrely put jam on the broom handle. The questions begin right away. Is my satchel seen by anyone? Was my payment made last night? Is this goat of mine? Marjorie responds to each with the same languid blink and monotone, maybe. The denials follow. I didn't spill that ale. The snoring wasn't mine. Regarding the monk's sandals, I never mentioned that. Everybody disputes everything, quite loudly, even in the face of concrete proof, such as a half-eaten turnip in someone's boot, or a ladle lodged in their belt. Bleary-eyed, the bard reappears and announces that he has composed a new verse on what happened that night. He is given a bowl of oatmeal right away and instructed to eat in silence. He obeys for once. They provide breakfast, the stew is warmed up, they pour ale, life goes on. The majority of visitors have either paid or bartered their way out by the time the sun has fully risen. Some go away with pride, certain they were charming, while others depart meekly. However, one fact is still true. After dinner, no one ever acknowledges what transpired. With the attention of a surgeon and the expression of a woman re-evaluating every decision that brought her to this point in her life, Marjorie is scraping something unidentifiable off a bench as the guests have begun to disperse and the goat has been escorted once more. Now that everyone has taken a breath, the common room is quiet, but not serene. The hearth crackles with a few coals. It's sticky on the floor. Due to abuse or protest, one bench leans slightly to the left. Behind the counter, the innkeeper holds a mug of the first brew of the morning as if it were a family relic. He mutters the same thing he does every morning as he looks across the room. Well, that wasn't too bad. Of course it was. However, optimism facilitates digestion. With a torn rag, a tray of used spoons, and the expression of someone who won't be responding to inquiries before dawn tomorrow, Marjorie passes by. She adds more water, salt, and faith to the stew pot and starts stirring. As usual, breakfast will be served. A wagon rattles by outside, a rooster makes its presence known, a smith hammers something that is too loud for this hour somewhere in the village, and suddenly everyone is awake once again, bringing with them new visitors. The door of the inn opens. A farmer intervenes, carrying a bag of what appears to be vegetables. Behind him, a woman wearing a travel cloak smiled politely, as if she were about to voice her displeasure with the costs. And a knight, without an indoor voice and with a dented helmet, of course. They scan their surroundings. They both nod. Money is exchanged. People ask questions. Responses are ambiguous. The cycle starts over. The innkeeper drinks. Marjorie puts her apron back on. They straighten a chair. They fill a mug. A complete stranger asks whether there is a vegan option as soon as they sit down. Not much changes at the inn. The stew remains a mystery. The visitors are still erratic. One assumes that the goat has an extra key. Nevertheless, they always return in spite of the chaos, the loudness, and the extremely unsettling odors. Perhaps it's the chaos, the company, or the warmth. Or perhaps, just possibly, it's the only spot in town where no one questions you before breakfast, and your blunders are covered up by the crumbs. The Dutch Republic was roughly the size of a pancake and equally flat at the beginning of the 1600s. Don't let geography deceive you, though. This small area of recovered wetland was going to be much more powerful than it looked. The Dutch quietly established an empire of light, money, and oil paint, while the rest of Europe was busy scheming over religion and whose king had the shiny boots. There was a revolution first. For decades, Spain had dominated the Netherlands, flying the Catholic flag and collecting taxes on everything from tulip bulbs to seafood. But the Dutch finally said, "We're done," in 1648 after nearly 80 years of kicking and screaming. Suddenly, they were at liberty. What came next was more of an entrepreneurial free-for-all than a national strategy. Imagine a Silicon Valley where everyone invests in herring and wears wooden shoes. Amsterdam turned into Europe's Wall Street. Ships bound for Asia, Africa, and the Americas flooded its ports. Anywhere there are individuals to take advantage of, or products to trade. Essentially, the Amazon Prime of the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company amassed enormous wealth through colonization, nutmeg, and porcelain. The true twist, however. Back home, people were reading newspapers, drinking beer, and seeing their neighbors be immortalized in oil by men named Rembrandt and Vermeer, while their ships were transporting cinnamon across oceans. These artists created legends in addition to portraits. Vermeer recorded intimate, silent moments that were illuminated like heavenly film. Rembrandt added more drama to biblical characters and elderly men than he did to a reality show. No longer was art reserved for kings. Portraits were also desired by merchants. A lovely still life with a lemon and a pig's head was within the reach of even butchers, aesthetically pleasing. There were the tulips after that. The notorious tulip frenzy, eh? People sold entire houses to acquire a flower bulb in this short but amazing episode. Just one light bulb. The Dutch had already made a name for themselves by that time, but the market crashed worse than a drunken sailor, extremely successful, a little crazy, and never dull. So how did a small, wet nation end up being Europe's envy? Through mastering the self-portrait, the stock market, and the sea. And this was only the start. The docks were the beating heart of the Dutch Golden Age, not a palace or a parliament. Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Hoorn, Delft. These were not merely urban areas, they served as launching pads for spreadsheets and sales that led to global dominance. The Dutch were busily creating capitalism, one logbook at a time, while Spain was still counting its riches and France was polishing its wigs. What's their hidden weapon? The flotilla of merchants. The Dutch possessed more ships than any other country in the world at its height. Greater than England. More than Spain. More than common sense should permit, perhaps. These were more than just attitude-driven fishing boats, though. These were sleek, functional, armed commerce ships with plenty of cargo and weaponry. Everything was carried by them. China's silk, Indonesia's spices, Brazil's sugar, and perhaps a cannonball to the face if pirates appeared. Known by its ominous abbreviation, VOC, the Dutch East India Company was the first international company in history. Dividends, stock markets, and shareholders. Indeed, capitalism existed before it was deemed hip or even moral. The VOC protected profit at any costs. Private armies, fortresses, and, let's not mince words, some quite brutal colonial strategies. It wasn't simply ruthlessness in the spice trade. It was conducive to beheading. Additionally, the West India Company was in charge of affairs in the Atlantic, while the VOC ruled the East. Imagine slavery, rum, and sugar. There was more to the Dutch involvement in the transatlantic slave trade than meets the eye. It was profitable, methodical, and systematic. The same nation that commissioned book-made paintings was also using a ledger to trade real lives. The underside of the Golden Age was severely tarnished. However, the Dutch also introduced a certain order to international trade despite their ruthless efficiency. Their vessels followed predetermined paths. They catalogued their cargo. Their ports were remarkably well insured, safe, and clean. The Dutch were the only country that could transport tulips, cheese, and explosives in the same boat without the labels getting mixed up. Not only were they negotiating seas, but they were also managing finances. The Dutch sent musket-wielding accountants, while other nations sent explorers. They used balance sheets in addition to swords to build their kingdom. And nevertheless, their little country continued to flourish in the midst of the marine bustle. We then cut to Vermeer's velvet-lit world, where ordinary life seemed to go on forever. There was another thing going on in the Dutch Republic's towns and households, almost inaudibly. As Dutch ships transported products across continents, and trading enterprises made golden chandeliers out of their quarterly profits. A girl poured milk. A lady put on her pearls. Beside an open window, a letter was read quietly, and every commonplace event was transformed into timeless poetry by a guy by the name of Johannes Vermeer. In his time, Vermeer was hardly the most well-known painter. He wasn't even the busiest, really. He created roughly 35 known pieces in total. In one bad week, Rembrandt spilled more than that on the floor. However, Vermeer's brightness more than made up for his lack of volume. Like someone painting sunlight holding its breath, his works are serene, collected, and uncannily bright. What made him unique? Accuracy, attention to detail, and an almost supernatural comprehension of light. His interior paintings were characters rather than merely scenery. The creak of the hardwood floors and the ticking of a clock were almost audible. And that's the Dutch Golden Age's secret. The sacredness of stillness was captured by artists such as Vermeer, while the surrounding world rushed ahead. Vermeer, of course, did not work his magic in a vacuum. This was a civilization that liked visuals. In the 17th century, the typical Dutch household had more paintings on the walls than kitchen utensils. There are still lifes, landscapes, cows, ships, portraits, and a lot of dead fish on tables. They adored everything. Why? Due to the fact that this was a middle-class nation. Brewers, bakers, and merchants were wealthy and tasteful. Cherubs floating in clouds was not what they wanted. The painters created something that resembled their environment, but had a little better lighting. Back to Vermeer, Dutch art developed into a fast-paced, meticulous, and surprisingly local industry. His art was neither ostentatious nor politicized. They didn't yell. Intimacy, loneliness, and the silent drama of domestic life were all discussed in great detail in their whispers. He immortalized the often overlooked by painting it. We will leave these golden-lit rooms and enter the streets of a flourishing republic in the upcoming chapter, because an economic experiment that would both sparkle and burst was simmering outside Vermeer's windows, the infamous tulip mania. Imagine this. In 1636 you enter a pub. You're just an ordinary Dutch person, perhaps a cheese dealer or baker. You are approached by a man who wants to sell you a tulip bulb. One bulb, not a bouquet. The cost? The same as your home. What about the insane part? You think about it. Welcome to the fever dream of early capitalism, tulip mania, which may have been the first financial bubble ever documented in history. Naturally, the Dutch did not create flowers, but they were very good at making money off of them. Tulips became status symbols, particularly the uncommon striped variants that were produced by a virus that strangely made them more attractive. Today, having a unique tulip bulb was like owning a Ferrari, except you had to dig it out of the ground and hope nobody mistakenly turned it into soup. Rich collectors were the only ones dabbling at first, but soon everyone wanted to join: barbers, chimney sweepers, and farmers. You were speculating in tulips if you had a pulse and could hold a coin. All of the savings were used. Contracts for futures were established. Bulb rights that had not yet blossomed were exchanged. Flowers were no longer the focus. Flipping a commitment before the petal even appeared was the issue. For a brief shining period, tulips were the Bitcoin of the 17th century. Then there was a crash. People stopped making purchases on a February day in 1637. Perhaps they were aware that they were mortgaging houses for plants after blinking. Perhaps someone truly thought, wait, that's it, after seeing a tulip. Prices fell, fortunes disappeared. Then all of a sudden you paid the price of a canal house for that one bulb. Not worth it. You might as well try to take in the scenery and plant it. Ironically, the tulip market did not cause the Dutch economy to completely collapse. Yes, that was embarrassing. Lawsuits were filed. Sermons about vanity and greed were delivered in public. However, the Republic brushed off its doublets, shrugged, and continued. It was the prettiest episode of their speculative fever, but it wasn't the last. A morality tale about arrogance, illogical markets, and the human need to pursue beauty until it bites was born out of tulip mania. The Dutch spirit, however, did not rot while the bulbs did. Because the Republic was constructing a cultural empire on books, maps, and ideas just around the bend, and we're going there next. Something else was subtly growing in the Dutch Republic while Vermeer was busy painting people doing very quiet things near windows, and tulips were being traded like gold. The intellect. The Dutch sent ideas, not just products. And that was risky business in the 17th century. First, let's talk about printing presses. The Netherlands became a shelter for writers, philosophers, and quill-wielding rebels during a period when publishing the incorrect idea in, say, Spain could result in your neat burning at the stake. As long as it didn't interfere with trade, the Dutch were generally accepting of free thought. In other words, books left Amsterdam like wine at a banquet for merchants. Here, ideas that were prohibited elsewhere found a safe haven. In the Netherlands, Descartes wrote and published. Here, the excommunicated Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza lived and thought in relative tranquility. He proposed that God might not be an old man in the sky, but rather something closer to reality itself. Until even the radicals found him too far. Universities like Utrecht and Leiden attracted intellectuals. Students traveled from all around Europe to study anything from the newest theories in anatomy and optics to law and medicine. And because they were Dutch, they studied in hygienic buildings and meticulously documented everything they knew. And cartography flourished. In addition to charting coastlines, Dutch cartographers like Joan Bleu were reshaping the European imagination. Their atlases were works of art, incredibly detailed for their time, ornamental, and occasionally grossly wrong. Do you have dreams about Brazil or want to explore the Java coast? Open a Dutch map, please. Scholars were not the only ones with this intellectual curiosity. People in the middle class read a lot. Scandalous poetry, scientific treatises, travelogues, and pamphlets. Stories were sent from Constantinople to the New World via newspapers. Literacy was no longer considered a luxury for the first time in European history. It was a way of life. But it wasn't all cappuccino and enlightenment. These concepts caused a stir. Tensions between religions simmered. There was censorship of philosophers. A few novels were subtly prohibited. The Dutch were quite tolerant, but when profits start interfering with property law, even tolerance has its limitations. Nevertheless, the Dutch made a significant contribution to the development of modern thought for a nation of only a few million citizens. Speaking of shaping, we move on to the architectural explosion that turned their cities into pompous gables, canals, and Baroque Lego sets. Consider a metropolis that is shaped like a painting. Soft curves, straight lines, and everything, even the ducks, in its right position. That was Amsterdam in the 17th century, a masterwork of urban planning made possible by merchants, engineers, and a resolute unwillingness to allow water to prevail. The Dutch drained cities into being rather than merely building them. Technically, a large portion of the territory the Republic was situated on was underwater, but it had lately been convinced that it wasn't. The Dutch changed their world with dikes, pumps, and sheer determination. Other countries recognized potential real estate where others saw marsh. The Grachtengordel, Amsterdam's canal ring, was the focal point of this watery wonder. It was sophisticated, effective, and as close to poetry as urban planning can get. The city was divided into districts by concentrated canals, not by cart, but by boat. Wealthy merchants constructed slender homes with sweeping windows and steep staircases to flaunt their wealth without appearing French. The tall homes with the elaborate gables were tax measures as much as aesthetic decisions. Because breadth, not height, determined property taxes, people built upward rather than outward, cramming luxury into vertical elegance. The outcome? A skyline of architecture that has a hint of Calvinist austerity and resembles gingerbread real estate. The preferred material was brick. It was affordable, long-lasting, and gave the streets the appearance of a Minecraft server from the Renaissance. However, design was more than just aesthetics. Utility was emphasized by the Dutch. Because the spiral staircases inside were less elegant and more claustrophobic, even their elaborate facade featured winches and pulleys to raise furniture through windows. Public structures also flourished: wayhouses, guild halls, and town halls. The most magnificent of all? The municipal hall in Amsterdam was completed in 1655. Louis XIV, as was his custom, reportedly referred to it as the eighth wonder of the world and immediately replicated it since it was so wonderful. Amidst all of this architectural beauty, a message was conveyed. The Dutch Republic had nothing to do with churches or monarchs. It was about civic pride, cities and citizens, order, elegance, neat facades, and clean streets. This constructed environment was accurate, pragmatic, and subtly prideful, reflecting a national ethos. However, conflict simmered beneath this order. International rivals, religious conflict, and political divisions were coming together. We explore the internal and foreign conflicts that would put this Golden Republic to the test in the upcoming chapter. The Dutch Golden Age, for all its genius, was not a utopia of peace and courteous cheese tasting. Beneath the oil paintings and tulips was a republic based on political, religious, and increasingly military strife. The politics come first. In the contemporary sense, the Dutch Republic was not a true republic. Each province fiercely protected its rights like a kid stockpiling snacks in a jigsaw puzzle. The affluent merchant class in places like Amsterdam and Leiden held the true power. These men had the money to pretend to be aristocrats, but they weren't. A military leader with just enough authority to make everyone uneasy, the stadholder was at the apex of the political pyramid and typically came from the House of Orange. Imagine him as a king with a warning. He was favored by certain provinces and disliked by others. The outcome? A never-ending struggle between provincial autonomy and centralized leadership. Half of the group wants to remove the leader, while the other half is the leader's cousin, in a form of political group project. Although the Dutch had officially split from Catholicism, this did not imply unity. The dominant group, the Calvinists, weren't particularly known for being tolerant. As long as they didn't create a scene, construct large churches, or organize parades, Catholics, Jews, and other Protestants were largely accepted. Everything was in order in public. It was tense in private. The old guard was upset that the Dutch had suddenly become a big force on the world stage. Once their Protestant friends, the English now viewed them as competitors in the marketplace. Thus began the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a string of naval conflicts in which both sides suffered the loss of ships, their pride, and sometimes their tempers. Admirals like Michel de Ruyter, who was equal parts national hero, pirate, and strategist, helped the Dutch hold their own. For fun, he once stole the English flagship while sailing up the Thames. However, war is costly. A fragile system was further taxed by maintaining fleets, protecting trade routes, and buying off neighbours to refrain from attacking. The Dutch were able to balance trade, culture, and colonies, but they were unable to do so indefinitely. The Golden Age's flaws had started to manifest in the system that created it, not in the artwork or the building. We'll then go to the end of this period and ask, how does a Golden Age come to an end? With a crash, a conflict, or just a historical yawn? Explosions are not usually the end of a Golden Age. Frequently, they decline in a silent, ungainly manner, akin to a gathering when the best people have already departed and someone has just finished the wine. In the late 1600s, the Dutch Republic was not in decline. There was a sigh. At first, the indicators were not too obvious. Although trade was still robust, rivals were catching up. The French and English were improving their naval combat skills and their ability to imitate Dutch corporate methods. A monarchy with a penchant for self-promotion was the one thing the Dutch lacked, so the English established their own East India Company and added some colonial ambition. In the meantime, Louis XIV's France had become extremely hostile. Versailles and expensive shoes weren't enough for him. In the process, he sought power, borders, and possibly a few Dutch cities. The ensuing conflicts were costly and cruel. The Dutch lost some, won some, and lost a lot of money. Boredom was another issue facing the Republic at home. Innovation slowed. Painters began copying what worked and ceased attempting startling new ideas. Ships, windmills, and rows of cows. Art was protected. The banking industry got wary. The energy had changed, but the canal buildings were still charming. The oil lamp flickered, and you could feel it. Deeper fractures were also present. The gap between Republican regents and the House of Orange widened. Once the driving force behind prosperity, the middle class started to stall. There were tensions between the new ambition and the old money. Most significantly, young Dutch people ceased to think of themselves as the center of the universe, since they were no longer. The last blow was a change in the wind rather than a single catastrophe. Elsewhere, the Age of Enlightenment was beginning. Britain became the financial and naval superpower of the world. The Dutch, once the wonder of Europe, were gently pushed out of the limelight while France took center stage in both art and science until the guillotine got involved. However, the Dutch Golden Age's legacy persisted. It persisted in galleries, libraries, shipping lanes, and legal codes. They were remembered by the world they shaped. They just ceased to be the protagonist. The enduring effects of this extraordinary period and how a little republic influenced the development of the modern world are then examined in our last chapter. Even if the Dutch Golden Age came to an end, its effects have persisted. Despite losing its position as the world's dominant nation, the 17th century republic left its mark on everything from economics to art to our conception of freedom. First, let's discuss capitalism. Money, trade, and greed were not created by the Dutch, but they were streamlined with amazing efficiency. They invented shareholder capitalism, produced financial instruments that are still in use today, and established the first stock exchange in history. Dutch merchants are to blame if you've ever cursed your mutual fund or looked at a line graph with blank indifference. Additionally, they transformed international trade through systems as well as ships. In Amsterdam, double-entry bookkeeping, insurance, and record-keeping were all nearly perfected. They were also logistical geniuses, even though they were by no means saints. Hello, colonialism. They made trading global, scalable, and predictable. Their impact on the arts endures forever. The intimate realism of home scenes, Rembrandt's stormy expressions, and Vermeer's serene light all contributed to the development of Western art's visual grammar. We learned from their art that greatness didn't need weapons and gods. Occasionally, it was a woman pouring milk, frozen in time. They made room for rationality in concepts. Though not flawless, the Dutch tolerance made it possible for intellectuals like Descartes and Spinoza to publish works that would have been destroyed in other places. They contributed to the Enlightenment movement in Europe by accomplishing this. Dutch soil was the birthplace of freedom of thought, religious pluralism, and scientific curiosity. They even have standards in their cities: the canals in Amsterdam, the colleges in Utrecht, the brick gables, and the well-kept, easily passable streets all served as models for contemporary urban life. Put utility in style, order without luxury. They didn't construct for monarchs, they constructed for the people, and maybe that's the main idea. There were no churches, empires, or divine rights during the Dutch Golden Age. With intellect, tenacity, and a little obsessive accountancy, it was about what a small, determined, rainy republic might accomplish. It was short-lived. Golden Ages don't work. However, the Dutch provided the world with a new paradigm of success during the fleeting radiance of that century, one driven by common people accomplishing remarkable feats rather than by royalty. They helped create the charts that show new waters, and as a result, the modern world sails in their wake. Forget national anthems, stadiums, and sponsorship agreements. That was absent from the inaugural Olympic Games: dust, perspiration, and a revered olive tree, no timers, no slow-motion replays, no polos-clad referees. It took place in Olympia, a peaceful religious retreat in the Peloponnese, and was devoted to Zeus, the lord of the gods, the champion of lightning bolts, and apparently a fan of athletic thighs. The year was 776 BCE. However, they weren't merely neighborhood pastimes to kill time in between harvests. They were revered, even considered religious. The ancient Greeks could not distinguish between physical beauty and worship. They saw competing nude in the Greek sun as a sign of spiritual devotion, rather than merely a way to flaunt oneself. It was considerably more acceptable to test your physical limitations in front of Zeus than to sacrifice goats or compose hexameter poems. The game's legendary beginnings are a tangle. According to some, Hercules established them after purging the Augean stables, which, to be honest, seems like the kind of thing you'd want to transform into something different. Others claim that after winning a chariot race, King Pelops, yes, the same man with the cursed descendants, started them. Whatever the case, the games were already prominent, formal, and documented by 776 BCE. The first occurrence ever documented? The stadion is a one-stage short-foot race that is around 600 feet long. That year, a cook by the name of Koroibos of Elis was the sole known winner. Yes, the first Olympic winner was a man who, most likely, practiced by chopping goat meat and rushing between kitchens. He received eternal glory, an olive wreath, and the ability to have poems about his thighs written about him instead of a trophy. Unless they were priestesses, women were not permitted to compete or even watch. All contestants were Greek, male, and citizens. Even by ancient standards, it seems a little severe that married women caught sneaking in had a chance of being thrown down a cliff. However, the stakes were really high in spite of the simplicity. Winning an Olympia brought honor to your city-state, or polis, and was not merely a personal victory. You had transformed from a guy into a hero. In ancient Greece, heroes lived eternally. A single-foot race may have kicked off the inaugural Olympic Games, but things swiftly got out of hand. What started as a single man running 600 feet evolved into a comprehensive program of competitions that put every male physical attribute to the test, including strength, speed, balance, and fighting skills while partially drenched in olive oil. Let's start with the fundamentals: running. More races were added after the stadium. In essence, the Diolos was the 400-meter dash of old, one track length there, one back. Then came the Dolichos, a long-distance race that might go up to 24 laps, or more than 5 kilometers, where competitors would be naked in the Greek summer sun. you, your feet, and most likely some extremely uncomfortable dust. No music playlists, no water breaks. However, speed wasn't the only factor. The games represented the Greeks' love of fighting sports. Pale or wrestling was a technical matter. Almost anything was acceptable, save for eye gouging and biting. To win, you have to knock your opponent down 3 times. It was a combination of boxing and wrestling, where nearly anything could happen, including punches, kicks, and chokes. It was the intellectual cousin of the much more chaotic pancration. It was raw, brutal, and adored. The guidelines? At the very least, avoid killing your opponent in front of the judges. Pygmachia, or boxing, was cruel. Only leather straps around the knuckles, no gloves. Surrender was the only way out, and matches frequently ended in blood and broken bones. It was more about surviving with your teeth, floating like a butterfly, and less. The pentathlon, a 5-event competition for all-arounders, came next. Running, wrestling, long jumping, javelin, and discus were all part of it. Weights called halteres were used during the long jump, ostensibly to increase momentum, which sounds more like a trip hazard than an athletic boost. And lastly, racing chariots. It took place in the hippodrome and was quick, risky, and sometimes lethal. The intriguing twist? The award went to the horse owners, not the drivers. Therefore, an aristocrat may still receive the olive wreath if he paid a stable boy to sacrifice his life for fame. Traditional. Men were pushed to and occasionally beyond their limits by each event. However, they were not vying for wealth or gold. In ancient Greece, they were after kleos, or eternal reputation, which was even more desirable. The Olympic Games meant more to the ancient Greeks than simply showing off your shiny biceps to the public. They were an act of worship, first and foremost. The athletes were more than just rivals. They were pilgrims. Olympia, too. It was more than just an arena. It was a hallowed location honoring Zeus, the lord of the gods. Olympia, which was more temple than stadium, was tucked away in a verdant woodland known as the Altes. The sacred atmosphere had to be respected before any races were held or discus thrown. The most crucial framework? The enormous ivory and gold statue of Zeus, sculpted by Phidias, was previously housed in the Temple of Zeus, a massive Doric masterwork. Indeed, it hovered above the games like a divine referee, and it was one of the 7 marvels of the ancient world. Days before the competitions, the customs started. Athletes swore not to cheat, bribe, or bite while wrestling in front of a statue of Zeus Horkeos, Zeus of the Oaths. It was blasphemy to break that commitment, not just bad sportsmanship. Bronze sculptures of Zeus, permanent reminders of their disgrace, lined the entrance road, while those who cheated were penalized and their punishments paid for. And there were sacrifices after that. Many of them. At Zeus's altar, dozens of bulls were killed. The blood, the smoke, the chanting, all of this was a part of a huge community sacrifice. Priests and spectators shared the cooked meat, transforming the games into a divinely sanctioned barbecue. The focal point of the ritual was fire. At the altar of Hestia blazed a sacred flame that was thought to have been ignited by the sun's beams. Fortunately, the animal sacrifice was not a part of this custom, which served as the inspiration for the present Olympic flame. Judges, athletes, and spectators, they came for religious refreshment and the opportunity to see divine favor made evident through human accomplishment, not simply for sports. Anticipation and incense filled the air. Zeus himself had smiled upon you if you won. Maybe you didn't pray hard enough if you lost. At night, when the contests were over and the altars were still warm, Olympia was alive with philosophy, music, and feasting. It combined worship, celebration, and spectacle. We hope you were Greek, masculine, and completely nude if you had aspirations of competing in the ancient Olympic Games. Sacred and prestigious, the Games were as exclusive as a Spartan wine club. The regulations are stringent, the prerequisites are daunting, and there is a very short list of people who are permitted to compete. Above all, athletes had to be Greek men of free birth, not slaves, foreigners, or even women. Greek masculinity in all its greasy splendor was on display at the Olympics. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Rhodes, and other city-states in the Greek world were among the competitors, only if they could demonstrate that they were descended from Hellenic people. Citizenship was a birthright, not just a piece of paper. You weren't even walking on the trail without it. Then there was the nakedness. It was commonplace to compete naked. Why? For starters, the Greeks thought that the human body, especially the masculine body, was the outward manifestation of heavenly perfection. It also made cheating more difficult. No armor, no secret weaponry, and no hiding behind gaudy equipment. You, your muscles, and perhaps a really bad sunburn. It was mandatory to train. In addition to completing a final month of closely monitored training at Olympia, athletes had to demonstrate that they had been training for 10 months. This was not an idle hobby. Running, grappling, and throwing heavy objects until you looked like a marble statue was the harsh program. Except for the useful plinth, let's talk about women now. They were prohibited from participating and, for the most part, from observing. If a married lady was seen attending, she might be expelled from Mount Tipion. Only unmarried women were exempt, especially priestesses who possessed front-row seats as part of their religious position, such as the priestess of Demeter. Women had their own games, though, so don't worry. Foot races for girls and young women were part of the Heraean festivities, which honored the goddess Hera. Of course, completely dressed. There were age groups, men, boys, and young people. However, you still needed to be prepared for someone twice your size to punch you. Furthermore, weight classifications did not exist. Taking on a man the size of a temple column in wrestling? Good luck, young one. Zeus determines the result. Ultimately, Greek civilization was reflected in the games just as much as physical ability. Patriarchal, proud, and strictly controlled. The ancient Olympic Games may appear to the untrained eye to be a healthy celebration of physical prowess and religious devotion. Beneath the wrestling matches and laurel wreaths, however, came something far more calculated. Politics. Because everything in ancient Greece was political, even the distance at which a discus could be thrown. The games provided the ideal setting for the polis, the frequently divided Greek city-states, to interact, compete, and practice the antiquated form of global public relations. Temples might be constructed in Athens and troops could be trained at Sparta. Olympia, though? They displayed their sense of national identity there. Not only did winning an event elevate the athlete, but it also elevated the city from which he originated. The triumph of one individual served as a billboard promoting his greatness in his hometown. As a matter of prestige, city-states even provided financial support and training for sportsmen. The people who jogged in from the olive grove were hardly amateurs. They were well-calibrated civic propaganda tools. Poetry, monuments, and ornate public rituals were used to immortalize victories. Olympic winners would receive free meals for the rest of their lives in entire cities. You symbolize our greatness like endless wine and lamb chops because nothing else can express it. But it wasn't only about showing off your muscles at the Olympics, they were used to show off alliances. The Games served as a diplomatic platform for political leaders. They talked about treaties, they negotiated marriages. The hallowed ceasefire that preceded the Games was even used to schedule military campaigns. Yes, Echetcheria, the Olympic truce. In order to allow athletes and spectators to go to Olympia safely, all Greek nations formally agreed to end hostilities during the Games. Theoretically, it was a pan-Hellenic peace moment. Actually, it was more of a courteous recommendation. There were conflicts that paused. Others just didn't pay attention to the memo. Naturally, Sparta's excessive war happiness resulted in at least one ban from the Games. Olympia was likewise politically sensitive, as were monuments. Cities that prospered or won wars frequently erected monuments or treasuries to show off their achievements. The sanctuary turned into a real marble arms race, a sort of archaic leaderboard. There were political repercussions even for cheating. The reputation of their hometowns suffered if an athlete was found to have fabricated citizenship or bribed an opponent, and that was almost as horrible as losing a war in the high-stakes realm of Greek rivalry. In ancient Greece, competing in the Olympics wasn't as simple as signing up and crossing your fingers. It was a harsh, permanent commitment. Devotion, self-control, and a startling quantity of sand in your undercarriage are all equally important. You had to demonstrate that you were prepared to run when you arrived at Olympia. Additionally, you had to endure months of torturous preparation before you could even approach the track. The gymnasium, a Greek establishment that combined elements of a philosophy class, a fitness center, and a temple, served as the training ground for athletes. Most of what you need to know is implied by the fact that the name gymnasium literally means place to be naked. The Greeks believed in glorifying the human body as a receptacle of divine might, which is why training was done in the nude, not for shock purposes. Serious Olympic aspirants flocked to Elise, the city that hosted the Games, even though each city had its own gymnasia. There, they underwent a required 30-day trial prior to the Olympics, watched over by officials and trainers. No drinks, no diversions, no excuses, just unrelenting workouts and a diet that would make today's sportsmen cry. Not eaten, barley bread, cheese, figs, and a lot of olive oil were spread on the body. The trainers were not kind. They were known as pediatribes. They forced their athletes to perform strength training, javelin throws, running, and wrestling drills. Slackers were not tolerated by the Greeks. You were out if you couldn't keep up. They meant it too. Contestants who failed to achieve the physical criteria were actually disqualified by judges before the Games ever began. It was all about discipline. No protein drinks, no gym memberships, no Instagram fans encouraging you, just the work. For a brief moment of fame and, if they prevailed, perhaps a lifetime of free meals, ancient athletes had to endure torturous temperatures, rigid diets, and exhausting repetition. And the body wasn't the only thing involved. It was believed that the perfect athlete should also be mentally well. Future champions debated philosophy, ethics, and the concept of arete, or excellence in everything, at gymnasia, which were also educational institutions. Participating at Olympia meant striving for perfection, not simply for strength or triumph, but also for a closer relationship with the gods. Over Olympia, the sun rises, excitement, perspiration, and incense fill the air. The holy sanctuary serves as the focal point of the Greek world for 5 days. The spectacle draws pilgrims, poets, merchants, politicians, and pickpockets. It's not a typical day. The gods are watching today. The opening procession combines flexing with ceremony. Athletes march in a line, their bodies nude and gleaming with olive oil. City-states wave banners, spectators shout, and judges known as the Hellenodikai watch with expressions that say, "We'll disqualify you for blinking funny." It's a huge throng. With only the rare olive tree and a strategically positioned sun hat for shade, tens of thousands of people swarm the stadium, sitting on stone or dirt embankments. There are no designated seats, no tickets, and no noteworthy restrooms. But what there is noise, a lot of it. Applause, taunts at competitors, wine and honeycake merchants, and intellectuals complaining about moral decay. The trumpet then blares, the action starts. With only a yell and the strain of 1,000 eyes, runners take off from their marks without a starting pistol. As they struggle in the sand, wrestlers throw up dust and slip in the oil. The hippodrome is a perilous place for chariot races, with hairpin corners where mishaps are common and sometimes fatal. What about the pancration? Things get so primal at that point, punching, choking, and twisting in Zeus's presence. Immediately following their competitions, winners are crowned with an olive wreath from Olympia's sacred tree. Just the noise of the crowd and a loop of branches, no podiums, no medals. The glory, though, eternal. Back home, victories are hailed as war heroes. Their likenesses are sculpted in marble and their names are inscribed in stone. And if they're fortunate, their actions will be immortalized in verse by a poet like Pindar, verse that is long, dramatic, and incredibly complimentary. And the holy presence remains throughout. Bulls are sacrificed, offerings are offered, and thanks are given to the gods, because every jump, throw, and run is an offering, a prayer made with strength and determination, and not just for attention. The masses pick up their amphorae and leave for home as the sports are over and the dust settles. However, life is never the same for a chosen few, those who are crowned with an olive wreath. Winning an Olympic medal in ancient Greece signified a complete life upgrading, not merely a sporting accomplishment. Winning in Olympia meant that you had pleased the gods in addition to defeating other men. And there were significant benefits associated with that type of heavenly favor. Poets sung their praises in lyrics so flowery they could outshine Aphrodite's gardens, statues were erected in their honor, and victorious people returned to their polis as heroes. Cities provided their champions free meals for life, which is a far better reward than a medal, especially in a world where dinner isn't assured. Other cities gave their champions front row seats at public events. Rich customers waited in line to sponsor you. Families set up greater marriage opportunities, and your name was taught to kids in school. Additionally, your face might be engraved on local currency, and your abs might be immortalized in bronze if you were from a small town. However, fame also brought expectations. The Olympic champions were not permitted to fade into obscurity. They turned into live examples of a city's magnificence. Some were recruited as generals, while others were sent on diplomatic missions. Their names now had to bear the honor that their bodies had earned. Naturally, some people did not manage the spotlight well. A few athletes become conceited. A remarkable attempt was made to dedicate a statue to the gods and himself, but the inscription was covertly altered by the populace. In subsequent games, others attempted to cheat in the hopes that their reputation would shield them. As a spoiler, it didn't. Those found to have lied about their citizenship or bribed opponents faced humiliation, fines, and occasionally the removal of their names from public records. However, kleos, or eternal fame, was the prize for the few who were honest. Kleos was the golden ticket in Greek culture, the opportunity to be remembered by history itself, not simply by your offspring or your community. Your name endured if you passed away young. You became a mentor, a legend, and possibly even a myth if you lived a long life. The Olympic Games became more than just a sporting event because of this. They served as a legacy forge. The Olympic Games burned like a sacred flame for more than a millennium, taking place every 4 years despite plagues and wars. Generations of Greeks congregated in Olympia starting in 776 BCE to honor the gods, strive for fame, and perhaps hurl a spear farther than anybody else. However, time affects even holy customs. The Greek world had been absorbed by the Roman Empire by the 4th century CE. During Roman administration, the games persisted, but their initial religious significance started to wane. Gladiators, chariots, and public blood sports were all spectacles that the Romans loved. But when your emperor believed he was a god, the idea of sport as divine devotion didn't translate as well. Then there was a last blow. Emperor Theodosius the Faithful, who had just become a Christian, outlawed all pagan celebrations in 393 CE. The Olympics were part of that. The torch was out after almost 1,000 years. Olympia's temples were abandoned to fall into ruin. What was once the center of the Greek world was buried by earthquakes and floods. Silence descended upon the sanctuary. The games were a thing of folklore for generations. Scholars adore these stories, which have been preserved in ancient books, but they are seen as a remnant of a world that has long since disappeared, until that ancient flame rekindled in the 19th century. A Frenchman named Baron Pierre de Coubertin thought it was time to revive the games after being moved by the spirit of ancient Greece and developing a new fascination with classical antiquity. Not behind olive trees in a dilapidated shrine, but as a contemporary global contest. The modern Olympic Games were thus born in 1896 in Athens, which is apt given that it is the birthplace of the sport. Even though modern games are larger, noisier, and much more elaborately dressed, remnants of the original can still be heard. The quest of something more than triumph, immortality through achievement, the 4-year cycle, the sacred torch lighted at Olympia, and the values of excellence, honor, and togetherness. The Olympic experience has never been linear. It has always been human, messy, wonderful, and always changing, from naked runners in dusty fields to televised gymnastics and synchronized swimming. Under Zeus's watch, it all started with a foot race, a garland of olive leaves, and a cook named Kouroibos. In the year 1791, the United States was a small nation and a costly experiment. Although the revolution had been successful, the conflict had left a massive debt in its wake. With the new constitution in place, the government was in financial trouble, and everyone was wondering who would foot the bill. Here comes Alexander Hamilton, the country's first Treasury Secretary, who not only admired but also revered robust financial structures. Hamilton thought that effective fiscal policy and federal authority were the keys to a strong nation. His scheme? Create a national bank, consolidate state debts under the federal government, and, the best part, raise money through taxes. And not just any taxes, but the whiskey tax, a government excise tax on distilled spirits. It made perfect sense to Hamilton. Throughout most of the nation, particularly on the border where access to pure water was not always guaranteed, whiskey was manufactured, consumed, and, let's face it, sipped like water. Whiskey taxation was analogous to taxing sunshine. However, farmers had different notions out on the western frontier, especially in western Pennsylvania. Many small-scale farmers produced their own whiskey in addition to drinking it. Because it was easier to transport, kept well, and could be used as money, they converted extra grain into booze. Whiskey was literally liquid gold. In order to take a cut, the federal government was now digging deep into their wallets. Even worse, small distillers who were barely making ends meet with homemade copper stills and a few corn kernels were disproportionately affected by the levy. Small farmers could pay a fixed fee to large producers. It felt like punishment by the bottle because they had to pay by the gallon. For these men, this was a betrayal as much as a tax. They were being told how to operate their stills by a far-off administration in Philadelphia, despite the fact that the revolution had been fought against taxes without representation. Some referred to it as familiar, while others labeled it tyranny. In log cabins and backwoods bars where the conversation shifted from irritation to defiance and all over whiskey, the seeds of insurrection were sown, not in the halls of Congress. You must comprehend the frontier mentality in order to comprehend why Western farmers erupted over a whiskey tax. Not only was life difficult west of the Alleghenies, but it was almost medieval. News traveled in weeks, roads were muddy trails, and government was a rumor from a distant place called Philadelphia. It was survival, not just a pastime, that kept the whiskey in the barn. Whiskey was more than just a beverage. It was a commodity, a form of money, and an integral part of culture. A gallon of corn whiskey might be exchanged for a pig, used to pay salaries, or used to purchase nails. The federal excise tax and air itself felt like they were being taxed. Small producers were particularly hard struck, since they were unable to pay the large distillers' lump sum flat charge. Rather, they paid taxes down to the last drop per the gallon. Thus, farmers resisted using muskets and pitchforks rather than paperwork. It started off as subtle civil disobedience. Forms were not filed, and tax collectors were disregarded. Then the intimidation started. When officials attempted to impose the levy, they were met with irate mobs and tar barrels. Resistance became particularly strong in western Pennsylvania. The collectors were attacked, threatened, or harassed. As a clear-cut example of frontier dress, one was stripped, whipped, and abandoned in the woods with feathers in his hair. Return home. Subpoenas were issued by the federal courts. Nobody arrived. Marshals attempted to bring them to them. The locals chased them away. It was no longer a protest by 1793. It was blatant non-compliance that spread like mush over counties. Why was it worse? These individuals were being taxed by a federal government that felt uncannily identical to the monarchy they had destroyed, despite the fact that the majority of them had fought in the Revolution and had sacrificed their lives for independence. "We just did this, didn't we?" was the silent and occasionally yelled sentiment. They saw Hamilton's tax as evidence that they weren't represented by the government. They witnessed the frontier suffering as the elites in the East lined their own wallets. With addition to being unpopular, the whiskey tax represented all of their fears over centralized power, and the government watched with growing alarm. What had started off as defying the law was beginning to resemble insurrection. What started out as dispersed rebellion had transformed into something far more organized, armed, and resolute by 1794. Western Pennsylvania was openly contesting the federal government's authority to rule at all, not merely opposing the whiskey tax. The flashpoint came in July 1794, when a U.S. Marshal named David Lennox and a tax inspector named John Neville, a wealthy former general, and one of the few men brave, or stubborn, enough to try collecting the tax, found themselves in the rebels' crosshairs. Neville had fortified his house, Bower Hill, outside Pittsburgh, preparing for trouble. It found out that several hundred armed guys were the source of the trouble. When the rebels requested that Neville and any tax paperwork that might implicate him be turned over, the standoff started. He declined. They fired shots. The following day, a full-fledged gunfight broke out. Locals, tax resistors, and government troops engaged in musket fire. 2 individuals were killed when Neville's house was eventually set on fire. It was an obvious message. There was no bluffing on the boundary. The opposition evolved into mobilization in the days that followed. Inspired by the spirit of 1776, a revolutionary militia of around 7,000 men organized around Pittsburgh and dubbed themselves Defenders of Liberty. They started holding conferences, making resolutions, and discussing independence. This time from the eastern United States, not Britain. Federal officers ran away, tax offices close. Pittsburgh attempted to disassociate itself from the uprising out of fear of being destroyed by fire. In the meantime, news of the rebellion traveled swiftly, leading to imitation resistance in areas of Virginia, Kentucky, and even the Carolinas. It was starting to resemble Shays' Rebellion 2.0, but with more firearms and better whiskey, according to many Americans, particularly those in government. It was unclear exactly what the rebels saw. Some advocated for Western independence, some for tax repeal, and some even proposed creating a new America west of the mountains. There was no doubt about that. This was no longer merely a protest against taxes. It constituted a challenge to the Constitution's power of the federal government. A dreadful question was posed by the uprising. What sort of union had they actually established if one area could violate a federal law without consequence? The Whiskey Rebellion had evolved from a local uprising to a direct challenge to the Constitution's authority by the fall of 1794. Elites in the East were afraid that federal authority would be overthrown. Rebels were speaking like revolutionaries in the West. President George Washington stood in the center, watching as his painstakingly constructed country started to fall apart. This was no typical case of law and order. In light of the new Constitution, it was the first actual test of federal power. Washington knew what was involved. The insurrection would send a strong message if it was successful or if it went unpunished. It was possible to disobey, embarrass, and ignore the federal authorities. Thus, he made a choice that startled the fledgling country. He would be the Army's commander. Washington became the only U.S. president to personally lead troops in combat, and continues to do so today. This was not ego for a man who had earlier resigned from office following the Revolution. It was essential. He aimed to demonstrate that the Constitution was more than simply paper. It was muscular. With Hamilton at his side and serving as his gregarious second-in-command, Washington organized a force of almost 13,000 soldiers, which was greater than the whole Continental Army at its height. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia militiamen gathered as if it were 1776 again. They weren't battling the British, though, this time. To confront their own compatriots, they were moving west. Gritty and methodical, Washington rode out in full military dress. He was there to intimidate, and he succeeded. The insurgents started to disperse as the army advanced westward. It was widely believed that the government would remain in Philadelphia and debate issues through letters. They hadn't anticipated a president on horseback, muskets, and drums. The majority of the revolt had dispersed by the time the Federal Army arrived in western Pennsylvania. Leaders disappeared, local backing vanished, the forceful display had been successful. Washington, however, did not desire blood. After securing the area, he gave over command to General Light Horse Harry Lee and left for Philadelphia. He had made his point. Laws might and would be defended by the government. There was no battlefield in western Pennsylvania when Washington's army arrived. They discovered quiet. Towns that formerly erupted in ferocious anti-tax sentiment now greeted federal forces with curiously courteous smiles, and the rebel militias had virtually disappeared into the hills. Bloodshed had not followed the end of the uprising. A retreat had been the result. However, at least in a symbolic sense, justice still needed to be done. Many of the more than 150 alleged rebels who were taken into custody were more confused than hostile. For merely being in the wrong tavern at the wrong time, several people were rounded up. The federal government needed to avoid appearing like a despot repressing impoverished farmers, while simultaneously demonstrating that it meant business. The balance was delicate. Only 2 guys were ultimately found guilty of treason. Both were convicted under the recently enacted U.S. laws for their roles in the assault on Neville's estate at Bower Hill. Washington then pardoned both of them in a turn of events that encapsulated the political complexities of the time. Why? Because Washington understood a lesson that most revolutionaries who become presidents eventually need to learn. Punishment is not always as important as togetherness. His argument had been made. They had defended the law. The Constitution had stood its ground. Putting a few whiskey rebels to death could have made them martyrs, or worse, rekindled the rebellion. Rather, Washington showed mercy. Yes, it was a premeditated move, but it was also typical of his leadership style, restrained in action, firm in philosophy. He wanted to set a precedent, not exact revenge. And there was no doubt about that precedence. The federal government possessed the authority to impose laws and the right to impose taxes. For the first time since the ratification of the Constitution, the central authority was put to the test and prevailed. Seldom. However, it was not the case for everyone. The uprising validated the worst concerns of several people living in the frontier areas, that Eastern elites were given more priority by the federal government than Western farmers, that bankers, not barrel makers, benefited from Hamilton's financial schemes, that perhaps, just possibly, the revolution had been in vain. However, the uprising waned. For a time at least the tax was still in place. However, its legacy would have a long-lasting impact on American politics. It was silent among the muskets. The rebels were scattered. But the real fight was only getting started on the political front. The Whiskey Rebellion revealed significant rifts in the fledgling republic's character, in addition to challenging federal power. And at the heart of this division were two powerful individuals, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who had quite different ideas about America. Hamilton, the creator of the whiskey tax, interpreted the uprising as evidence that a powerful central government was not only required but also vital to the survival of the country. He envisioned an industrial, metropolitan, prosperous, and internationally renowned America. He saw the forced demonstration in Pennsylvania as a victory for law and order. Jefferson, though, he saw something very different. The military response by Washington and Hamilton, rather than the revolt itself, horrified Jefferson, who was then Secretary of State. The government had appeared more like an empire than a republic to Jefferson and his expanding base of agricultural supporters. Confronting irate farmers over a booze tax with 13,000 troops, it was intimidation, not enforcement. He was concerned that Hamilton's plan would establish a country dominated by elites, bankers, and merchants, the same people who had sat in London parlours while colonists fought at Bunker Hill. The values of the independent farmer were important to Jefferson's rural, decentralized America. The Whiskey Rebellion was used as political fodder. James Madison and Jefferson started organizing against Hamilton's Federalist policies. They presented themselves as the defenders of liberty, the Constitution, and the average person, and their movement would soon be known as the Democratic Republicans. During the Reign of Terror, Jefferson's supporters were portrayed by the Federalists as mob sympathizers who would turn America into France. In other words, the insurrection contributed to the formation of America's first political parties, which had previously merely been simmering. They drew lines, the newspapers took sides. The argument over the whiskey tax came to symbolize a broader conflict between elite rule and popular opposition, as well as between local autonomy and centralized power. Therefore, the insurrection persisted politically even when it was put down militarily. It turned into a tale that would be recounted by both sides in rather different ways. Although the Whiskey Rebellion was put out on the battlefield, it ignited a political fire that would burn for years. Whiskey and taxes were no longer the only issues. It became into a symbol, and like most symbols, its use varied according to the person using it. The revolt was seen by Federalists as evidence that the new Constitution was effective. This moment was different from the turmoil of the Articles of Confederation, when the government could hardly purchase ink, and insurrection had gone unpunished. When the law was contested, it reacted. Mature, responsible governance was demonstrated by the peaceful dispersal of the insurgents, followed by fair trials and presidential pardons. It was not misused, rather, power was restrained. But the entire situation smacked of hypocrisy to the Democratic Republicans. The federal government, controlled by Eastern elites, had marched an army across the Appalachians to put down a protest by impoverished farmers who had fought the revolution over taxes without representation. It felt more like occupation than unity. For them, the uprising represented a government that had lost sight of its origins. This struggle of ideologies permeated public conversation. Newspapers published scathing editorials. The definition of liberty was discussed in political clubs. Was the uprising a desperate cry for justice from the periphery of the Republic, or was it a perilous echo of mob rule? The term rebellion was even disputed. It was a traitorous revolt, according to Federalists. It was referred to as civil disobedience by democratic Republicans. Over time, the significance of the 1794 events took precedence over the actual occurrences, and the Constitution itself loomed above everything. The federal government first put its new legal system to the test against actual opposition during the Whiskey Rebellion, and it prevailed. It demonstrated that the federal-state power balance was more than simply a theoretical concept. It might be put into effect, however, it also brought to light a fact that the founders were unable to overlook. Different people had different experiences with the Constitution. It was protection for Philadelphia's elites. It was devastating for Western Pennsylvania farmers. The frontier reverted to its typical routine of hard work, hard weather, and hard booze as the smoke cleared and Washington's men marched home. Although the insurrection was technically over, the animosity and its repercussions persisted for a long time. The whiskey tax was still poorly enforced even though the federal government had stated its point. In the western counties, collectors were still hesitant to reveal their identities. There was little revenue. The tax was still entirely disregarded in some areas. Although the law existed in theory, it was not applied in reality. The irony was that the whiskey tax hardly worked after all the theatrics, the military display of power, and the lofty rhetoric about national authority. Even the policy's creator, Alexander Hamilton, started to see that the expense was not justified. An opposition party was born, there was a significant political backlash, and anti-federal feeling was stoked that would plague the Federalists for years to come, all for a tax that generated very little income, not quite a victory. At the same time, popular sentiment was changing. The frontier was more than a backward anomaly, it was expanding quickly. There were more settlers moving west. The notion of a centralized government taxing the livelihoods of the frontier started to feel more like a grudge than a kind of control. Thomas Jefferson carried a completely new mindset with him when he was elected president in 1800, marking the first peaceful transition of power between opposing political parties. Jefferson aimed to reduce government interference, particularly with small farmers, in contrast to Hamilton's goal of strengthening the federal government. And one of his first presidential actions, repealing the tariff on alcohol. By 1802, it had disappeared. The contentious tax that had spurred rebellion, influenced early political identity, and propelled George Washington into conflict, suddenly disappeared. With a few pen strokes, it vanished silently. Not a riot, no fire. Just a tacit acknowledgement that sometimes the struggle for dominance isn't worth it. Yes, the law had stood, but so had the people. Despite its symbolic value, the whiskey tax's disregard for the lives of those on the fringes ultimately demonstrated how brittle government authority might be. Our last chapter will consider the Whiskey Rebellion's lasting effects and how they continue to reverberate in discussions about protest and governmental authority today. The Whiskey Rebellion's legacy endures, aged like the booze that ignited it. Even after the muskets are long silent, the barrels are empty, and the tax has been abolished. It could initially appear to be a minor detail in the lengthy narrative of the early republic, a local conflict, mishandled attacks, and a fleeting moment of armed demonstration. But if you look closely, you'll discover a moment that perfectly captures a significant national issue. How far will individuals go to oppose the people in positions of power? The uprising made the nation confront difficult issues. Could laws be enforced by the federal government? Indeed. Would this, however, destroy the very unity it aimed to maintain? Yes, too. It demonstrated that a republic cannot function solely on paper and emphasized the fine line that separates liberty from the law. Perception, involvement, and trust are its pillars. Washington's choice to ride out with the troops was more than just a show of support. It was a symbolic move that showed the Constitution was more than just words and paper. The opposite of that, however, was demonstrated by Jefferson's subsequent revocation of the tax. In addition to leading, federal authority must listen. The core of American politics is found in that conflict between empathy and enforcement. The Whiskey Rebellion eventually turned into a case study on governance. It is cited by academics when talking about the origins of American political parties, the boundaries of protest, federal power, and current discussions about taxes, rural disenfranchisement, and government overreach. They have an uncanny resemblance to this tale. The insurrection is still powerful, even on a cultural level. Only once has a sitting president of the United States command troops in combat. It pushed the limits of dissent in a fledgling democracy, altered national discourse, and ignited political movements. In many respects, whiskey had nothing to do with the uprising. When the government makes decisions that impact people's daily lives, it was about who gets to hear it. The tale of the Whiskey Rebellion is still used today as a cautionary tale and a reminder that power must always be used carefully. Sometimes, the distinction between provocation and governance is so small that it can be seen through a glass of corn mash. The whiskey may have matured due to history, but the revolt remains unquenchable.